I think part of when we think about sexual violence against in later life, we don't think about the diversity about later life in and by itself. So when we talk about 50 and up, particularly up to 100 or even beyond, sexual violence means something very different. And so individuals in their 50s and 60s may think about it in terms of sexual assault. Older people probably won't. Older than late 60s, they'll think about it, usually in my experience, as a trauma, an invasion, a violation, but they won't attach the words of sexual assault.
What are some things about sexual abuse, sexual assault in later life that might be different than sexual assault of other victims?
The biggest issue that we've seen is actually physical. Elder victims are more likely to have genital injuries than younger victims. Elders bruise more easily. They take longer to recover from injuries of any kind. But they have found that sexual abuse does have a greater physical impact on older victims.
Are there other issues that these victims might experience that advocates should know about?
Yes, when a person is older, they certainly experience age-related disabilities, both physical and mental. And what can happen, these certainly are risk factors in sexual violence. It's an opportunity for somebody to perpetrate, and there is a greater dependence on care providers as some of these disabilities progress, which unfortunately is a risk factor for sexual violence.
What can you tell us about perpetrators of sexual violence in later life?
You know, the easy answer would be anyone, and that's never comforting for anybody to hear. In my experience, I think frequently we look at registered sex offenders and assume they're the only people in the world that are molesting or abusing at any phase of life. That's not true. The reality is that when we look at sex crimes, it's very rarely a stranger. In elder abuse, more likely than not, it will not be a stranger. It will be a caregiver, whether paid or otherwise, a family member. It will be somebody that accesses vulnerability, accesses usually the vulnerability, the accessibility, and the opportunity to, in my opinion, look at the older adult and believe that they're not a believable victim. And so that's the motivation behind who they choose.
There is no single profile for perpetrators of sexual violence against individuals in later life. It really runs the gamut. It can be paid or unpaid care providers. It can be family members. It can be intimate partners. It can be strangers. We've seen cases of all of those. Individuals perpetrating sexual violence. And the other piece is we've seen both men and women as perpetrators, and then we've seen perpetrators across the age span, from juveniles to peers of the elder victim.
Karla, where does the sexual abuse of older adults occur?
It happens multiple places, and certainly elder adults live in very different facilities. Some remain in their homes and receive care services at home, or do not receive care services at all. And then some reside in assisted living facilities, personal care homes, nursing homes.
When we think about sexual assault, we have always thought about it as it relates to rape, as it relates to a penis and a vagina. And what we've not thought about is that sexual acts happen in a variety of ways. Some are visual, some are touching, some are by words, some about forced hygiene habits that are not necessary for health or well-being. And what it really speaks to when we look at sexual violence, it's not the act, yet culturally I think we get hung up on the act. It's really the impact of the violence. And when we think about impact, it's the losses. And so losses include loss of trust, safety, respect, healthy memories, loss of boundaries, a loss of belief in myself and my personal power. And that's what we see both short-term and long-term when anybody's been victimized. And when we think about particularly older adults, we can look at who's had the experience of historical trauma. Then we look at how many of our children are abused and sexually molested. And then we look at trauma that may happen in interpersonal violence, possibly with other acquaintances. When we look at the healing process for the older adult, all of those pieces of trauma come into play. And what I've observed and experienced is that we try to blame, when an older adult, particularly an older adult, tries to talk to us about what happened, he or she or they may not use the words of sexual assault, but they're describing the impact, they're describing what it means to them, and they're describing their lack of safety.